2024 has been a very interesting year for cinema. It's the year that Marvel had the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time, Pixar had the highest grossing animated movie of all time, and the Xenomorphs became scary again. But it's also the year that Borderlands came to the big screen as a PG-13 Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff. Sony's sad little Spidey villain universe came to an unceremonious end. Zack Snyder dropped two different versions of two different films nobody wanted to watch. And the director of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now came out of the woodwork to deliver one of the worst movies ever made. Pharrell Williams made a documentary about his life in the form of Lego animation. Robbie Williams made a biopic about his life where he's played by a CG monkey. Michael Keaton reprised his role as Beetlejuice. Ridley Scott put a swarm of sharks in the arena with his gladiators, and Adam Sandler got marriage counseling from a giant spider in space. 2024 has shat out some of the worst films I've ever seen. Damsel, Pool Man, Miller's Girl, and of course Megalopolis. And there were a handful of bitter disappointments that I hoped would be much better, like Apartment 7A and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. But there were also a few movies I liked a lot more than I expected, like Jackpot, The Idea of You, The First Omen, and Don't At Me, Joker Folie à Deux. And Unfrosted was a lot more fun than a Jerry Seinfeld directed Pop-Tart movie had any right to be. Before we begin the list proper, I've got a few honourable mentions. Priscilla is a beautifully nuanced portrait of one of pop culture's most famous love stories. The Holdovers is everything I wanted from a Sideways reunion. It's a profoundly touching enemies to friends story that's equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. Kinds of Kindness is weird as hell and I loved it. Longlegs is a deeply unsettling serial killer thriller with an unforgettable performance by Nicolas Cage, and a painfully relatable turn by Micah Monroe as a detective who's comfortable around mutilated corpses but uncomfortable in social situations. Beverly Hills Cop Axel F was a welcome return to one of my favourite movie characters. His Three Daughters is a really beautiful character piece with incredible writing, incredible acting, and a deeply affecting ending. The Iron Claw broke my heart, opened my eyes to what a great actor Zac Efron is, and might be the best film ever made about men's complicated relationship with emotion. And Alien Romulus was already my favourite Alien film since Aliens in its first two acts, and then The Offspring showed up and took it to a whole other level of insanity. There were some films this year that I fully expected to appear on my top 10 months before they came out, like another George Miller Mad Max film, or another Denis Villeneuve Dune film, or a movie where Deadpool meets Wolverine. But there were also a few surprises that snuck up on me, like a gonzo body horror satire about Hollywood's unrealistic beauty standards, and a black and white slapstick comedy starring grown men in beaver costumes. I should add the disclaimer that some of the films mentioned here technically came out in 2023, or even 2022, but didn't come out in the UK until 2024. And I should also add the obligatory disclaimer that this is not an objective list of the greatest films of 2024. These are just my personal favourites from the past year. Anyway, without further ado, let's dive in. Look, I love Kurosawa, I love Godard, I love Fellini and Kubrick and Agnes Varda. I love what Martin Scorsese calls cinema, but I'm also a shameless Marvel fan. And if they give me all the things I want to see, like Hugh Jackman in the classic yellow Wolverine costume or Wesley Snipes back in action as Old Man Blade, then I'll be a very happy man. Watching Deadpool and Wolverine in a packed house this past summer was one of the most joyous theatrical experiences in recent memory. It's still a fun ride watching it at home on Disney+, but watching it with a crowd with all the surprises intact was something else.
Oh my god, he's gonna say it.
Say what?
Avengers! Flame on!
Sorry, what now?
I recognize that Deadpool and Wolverine doesn't 100% hold together as a movie. Deadpool's character arc is paper thin, he's motivated by saving the people he cares about, but when he hangs out with those people in one single scene at the beginning of the film, he doesn't seem to care all that much about them. Elektra and the other legacy characters' motivation that they want an ending for their stories is a bit too meta to make a personal connection. That's not what a human being would want, it's what the franchise crossover wants. The only part of the movie that has any actual emotional substance is Hugh Jackman's incredible performance as a washed-up Wolverine filled with remorse, but the film barely slows down to take advantage of that. It never feels as though anyone is in any real danger. Cassandra Nova is introduced as an unbelievably powerful villain, but she never feels like a real threat to the main characters, and the outcome of the plot is completely predictable. But I'm perfectly willing to forgive all of that, because this movie achieves the one thing that all superhero films should. It's a hell of a lot of fun. Ryan Reynolds is as comfortable in the role of the Merc with a Mouth as ever, and his mismatched on-screen dynamic with Jackman's Wolverine is reminiscent of Midnight Run and Planes, Trains and Automobiles. Whether they're trading banter or slicing and dicing bad guys, often doing both at the same time, it's a delight to see these two characters side by side at last. They've been teasing this team up for years, expectations were sky high, and against all odds, Deadpool and Wolverine managed to live up to the hype. I hope this isn't the last we see of this superhero odd couple. Deadpool and Wolverine isn't a particularly emotional movie, although I love the campfire scene with Daphne Keene's Laura, and I will admit to getting choked up when Deadpool tells Wolverine, who's been told the whole movie that he's the worst Wolverine, that he's the best Wolverine.
You're the best Wolverine.
But despite slowing down for a couple of quieter dramatic moments, this movie isn't trying to be some tear-jerking tragedy. Above all, it's an action comedy that just wants to entertain, and it succeeds at being both thrillingly action-packed and laugh-out-loud hysterical. It has some of the most engaging action sequences of the year, from the opening fight with the TVA set to Bye 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 to the climactic street brawl with the Deadpool core. And it has some huge laughs. Channing Tatum's incomprehensible gambit is a delight.
Yeah, we don't be knowing that lid ain't coming off without that dome gonna come off with it.
I'm so sorry, beautiful. I want this to be gentle. Who is your dialect coach? The Minions?
Matthew McFadden has the thankless job of the straight man, and he's an absolutely hilarious foil for Deadpool.
He has risen, baby girl. Fuck!
And this movie has the best post-credits punchline since Airplane. Deadpool and Wolverine isn't a perfect movie, but it is an extremely fun ride. I love Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, and I love them even more when they're bouncing off each other. This film shows us how much more fun Marvel's multiverse could be. It gives us Blade with a rocket launcher and Johnny Storm without skin, and I'll never listen to Like a Prayer the same way again.
You are a PhD student.
No. What? You're joking.
But I don't want to tell you in what, because I want you to have something to look forward to.
Look forward to?
Yeah.
Did you just tell me I'm in my 40s and I'm still in school?
30s.
Based on the clever high-concept premise and the presence of Aubrey Plaza, I fully expected My Old Ass to be one of the funniest films of 2024. What I didn't expect was that it would also be one of the saddest. In the first half of this movie, I really got a kick out of the quirky, odd couple pairing of a bright-eyed 18-year-old girl and her jaded 39-year-old self. But by the end of it, I was bawling my eyes out. In fact, for the first few days after I watched it, even just thinking about it would make me cry. If the name Chad crossed my mind, it would set me off. I knew My Old Ass would be a fun coming-of-age comedy, and it was, but I was delighted to find that it was also one of the most emotionally enriching films I watched this year. The premise of a kid taking magic mushrooms and meeting their middle-aged self was a great setup for a comedy, but writer-director Megan Park buries an even more ingenious conceit within that. The one piece of advice that 39-year-old Elliot passes on to her teenage self is to avoid anyone named Chad. The next day, Elliot meets a guy named Chad who's got a summer job at her parents' farm. And since we've been warned about Chad, you then spend the whole rest of the movie being suspicious of Chad, keeping a close eye on him. How's he gonna hurt her? And there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with him. He's the sweetest, most lovable, most perfect guy imaginable. If Elliot doesn't fall in love with him, I will. And that leads us to the devastating twist that turned My Old Ass from a movie I was really enjoying to one of my favorite films of the year. As it turns out, Chad is the greatest guy in the world, and he's gonna die, and older Elliot wants younger Elliot to avoid him so she can avoid the pain of losing him.
Chad dies. And he dies after you have fallen so madly in love with him that you can't see straight, okay?
Not only is this an absolutely heartbreaking twist that made me sadder than maybe anything else I've seen on screen this year, it also facilitates the movie's beautifully life-affirming message and shows that the transfer of wisdom isn't a one-way street. In her naive teenage optimism, young Elliot has just as much wisdom to offer her disillusioned older self.
I'm gonna love him so hard for however long we have.
Yeah, you're just saying that because you're young and dumb.
Okay, but if you weren't young and dumb, you'd never fucking be brave enough to do anything. If you knew how shitty and unfair life would be, you'd never leave your house.
Young Elliot doesn't want to deny herself the greatest happiness of her life just because it'll lead to the deepest sadness of her life, because that's life. You have to take the good with the bad. It reminded me of the twist ending of Arrival in a really touching way. If you don't allow yourself to feel immense sadness sometimes, then you'll never get to experience true happiness. I've loved Aubrey Plaza since Parks and Rec, so I knew she'd be great in this movie. She's the reason I watched it in the first place. And she is great in it. But for me, the revelations in this cast were two of Plaza's co-stars. Maisie Stella gives a star-making turn as younger Elliot. She's so funny and so charming and so lovable that you can fully believe she could grow up to be Aubrey Plaza. She nails both the comedic and dramatic aspects of the performance. Her portrayal of an outgoing teenager with no filter is hilarious, but her portrayal of a kid trying to reconnect with her family is really moving. and Percy Hines-White gives an incredible performance as Chad. I thought he was good in Wednesday, but this is something else. If you don't absolutely love Chad, then the movie doesn't work, and Percy Hines-White completely succeeds in making you fall in love with Chad. From Lady Bird to Little Miss Sunshine, I love movies that alternate between making you laugh hysterically and making you cry hysterically. It reflects the emotional roller coaster of life, and My Old Ass is a perfect example of that. It might have a silly title, but it's a deeply human story that taps into the full spectrum of emotions. Just like Elliot decides to experience love even though she knows it'll end in tragedy, I'm deciding to name My Old Ass as one of my favourite films of the year, even though it made me sob for days. Come for the high-concept comedy, stay for the heart-wrenching drama. I'm a sucker for a good revenge story. I love straightforward revenge fantasy stories like Kill Bill and Death Wish, and I love grim deconstructions of the futile cycle of violence like Unforgiven and The Last of Us Part 2. And Furiosa somehow manages to be both at once. I've been a Mad Max fan since I was a little kid, and it's been a joy to watch George Miller bring the franchise into the modern blockbuster age over the past decade. Furiosa might not be as action-packed as Fury Road, but it's arguably a more compelling story and a more emotionally involving experience. Miller has had a reputation as one of the world's greatest action directors since he burst onto the scene in the late 70s, and the thrilling set pieces in Furiosa prove he hasn't lost his touch. Furiosa has some of the most exhilarating action scenes in the entire Mad Max franchise. Not just impressive stunts, but immersive staging and inventive twists. From Dementus' failed invasion of the Citadel to his ambush at the Bullet Farm to the Octoboss's attack on the War Rig, this movie has some of the most mind-blowing action sequences of the year. Furiosa belongs to the Pam Grier school of revenge stories. Pam Grier movies like Coffee and Foxy Brown would have something horrible happen to the protagonist in the opening scene that made you really root for them to exact revenge against the people responsible. Then they'd have more and more horrible things happen to them that made you really root for their revenge. You want Furiosa to fuck up Dementus from the second he murders her mother. Then, as he enslaves her and exploits her and ruins her entire life, you really want to see her fuck him up. Miller assembled a hell of a cast to bring these crazy post-apocalyptic warriors to life. After proving herself to be a great dramatic actor, a delightful comic performer, a formidable scream queen, and a terrific voice actor, Anya Taylor-Joy adds yet another feather to her cap as she proves she's also a badass action hero. Chris Hemsworth is absolutely hilarious as Dementus. That's one of the funniest performances I've seen all year. Mad Max villains are usually stoic and stony-faced, but Dementus never shuts up. He'll say whatever he has to say to talk himself out of trouble, and Hemsworth got every possible laugh out of that bumbling, blustering baddie.
He slaughtered my mother.
True? That is true. And I can tell you it made this child tough enough to survive all sorrows that may come her way. I did that for her.
Tom Burke was a welcome surprise in this movie in the role of Praetorian Jack. I've always thought Burke was a fine actor. He was fantastic in The Souvenir, and his Orson Welles was one of the few bright spots in Mank. But I didn't think he could play this kind of Max Rokitansky-esque lone wolf hero, and play him so damn well. I don't think Furiosa is the best Mad Max film. Fury Road and The Road Warrior are slightly tighter, slightly crazier, and slightly more mind-blowing. But I do think it has the best ending of a Mad Max film by far. This movie spends 2.5 hours building up to Furiosa's revenge against Dementus. After all that build-up, it would have been a huge letdown if that revenge amounted to a bullet in the back or something equally underwhelming.
The question is, do you have it in you to make it epic?
Thankfully, Miller had something a little wilder in mind. He had a typically twisted revenge scheme up his sleeve all along. According to the History Man, Furiosa took Dementus back to the Citadel and used her mother's peach pit to plant a tree in his still-living body. This was a gruesomely satisfying and weirdly poetic way to wrap up the revenge story. Not only is it a horrific fate befitting of your mortal enemy, it ties it back to the reason she was seeking revenge in the first place. It was Furiosa's mother's last wish that she plant that pit, and she found a way to plant the pit, fulfill her mother's wish, and make Dementus' life a living hell in the process. It's a shame we probably won't see any more Mad Max films after Furiosa bombed at the box office, because Miller is clearly still going strong, and this is one of the few franchises that demands to be seen on the biggest screen possible. Much like Fury Road, Furiosa really rewarded a trip to the cinema. The dazzling colours of the wasteland lit up the screen, the roar of the engines blared out of the speakers, and the visual storytelling required your full, undivided attention. It's a really invigorating movie that puts most blockbuster filmmaking to shame.
So, how long you been doing this?
That's none of your fucking business.
Shit, look at Gary.
You called me to do a job.
The man is a natural.
David Fincher's The Killer was one of my favourite films last year, and Richard Linklater's Hitman was one of my favourite films this year. If I can look forward to a different legendary director releasing a new subversive Hitman movie on Netflix every year, I could certainly get used to that. Linklater is one of my favourite filmmakers. School of Rock is my all-time favourite movie, Dazed and Confused is in the top 5, and I think the Before trilogy is one of the most beautiful love stories ever told. So I fully expected to enjoy his latest film, but what I didn't expect was just how much I'd love it. I've been a fan of Glenn Powell ever since he stole the show in Scream Queens 9 years ago, so I've been delighted to see him finally become a big star in the last couple of years with Top Gun Maverick and Anyone But You. Since Powell co-wrote the script for Hitman with Linklater, it gave him a lot more control over the project than he usually gets as an actor for hire. It's like he wrote himself the perfect starring vehicle, Damon and Affleck style. Powell is a charismatic movie star, a terrific dramatic actor, a hilarious comedic performer, and a charming romantic lead. And in Hitman, he gets to be all four at once. It's truly a tour de force performance. Powell has to convince us he's a geeky, awkward, mild-mannered academic. Then that character has to convince his own audience that he's a cold-blooded killer, oozing confidence and charisma. It's a performance within a performance, and Powell sells every bit of it. As he embodies different types of movie hitmen to suit different perps he's trying to con, he ends up playing a wider variety of different characters in this movie than James McAvoy in Split. He's a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude. Real life handed Powell and Linklater this juicy, high-concept comedy premise on a silver platter. Gary Johnson is a dorky college professor who does some surveillance work with the New Orleans police, using a fake hitman to catch people out for soliciting murder. One day when their go-to undercover hitman is suspended, Gary is called upon to take his place. In the guise of a hardened killer named Ron, he finds that he has a level of confidence and self-assurance that he could never dream of in his regular neurotic life as Gary. This premise tees up a bunch of great gags, and eventually a complicated love story. The movie deviates wildly from the true story. Linklater and Powell took that setup and built their own crazy caper on top of it. But it's refreshing that the movie itself is very open about the artistic liberties it took and which parts are fictionalized. Most true crime movies just take the artistic liberties and run. Linklater and Powell's script sets up its brilliant premise in just the first few minutes. It's a masterclass in getting to the point. Gary gets his call to action at the 4-minute mark. Once Gary gets into the restaurant and Powell delivers that incredible monologue that instantly proves him to be a natural, you're locked in. You know exactly who this character is, you know exactly what this movie will be, and you're completely on board with it.
No, I don't buy it.
What?
You're not a hitman. You can't be. I tried looking you up and nothing. It's like you don't even exist.
I guess I'm just your fantasy.
Hitman doesn't get into full swing until Adria Arjona shows up as Gary's love interest, Madison. The romantic subplots are usually my least favourite parts of these kinds of films, but Powell and Arjona share such electric chemistry that their steamy romance becomes the heart of the movie. For the first hour and 20 minutes, Hitman is a fun romantic comedy about this torrid affair built on lies. But in its last half an hour, it goes to a whole other level of craziness as Gary finds himself in way over his head trying to cover up a real murder.
He was either passed out or asleep.
And you killed him?
That climactic notes app scene in which Gary goes undercover one last time to clear Madison's name is a thing of beauty. Gary acts as Madison's director and scene partner, and Madison just goes with it, and Powell and Arjona play it spectacularly.
I'm catching heat for the death of your husband. They're thinking one of us did it.
Well, it wasn't me.
Look, I know you did it. It's fucking obvious, and I don't blame you.
I didn't kill him. Wait, who's accusing me of this?
The Killer for Hire is one of my favourite stock characters in genre fiction. I'm exactly the kind of gullible idiot this film is making fun of, so I'm predisposed to like any movie about a hitman. I love straightforward hitman movies like Leon, John Wick, and Collateral, and I love sly, satirical deconstructions of hitman movies like In Bruges, Pulp Fiction, and Grosse Pointe Blank. But I've never seen a movie deconstruct the hitman archetype quite like this one. This is the first true deconstruction of the hitman movie. Films like In Bruges and Pulp Fiction have subverted the tropes of hitman movies, but they still played into the genre formula. Hitman plays on the phoniness of any movie featuring a hired killer, and the morbid fantasy that the hitman genre has created in society. The protagonist is pretending to be a typical movie hitman and trying to catch out people who believe in the Hollywood myth of the killer for hire. It's the hitman movie to end all hitman movies. I've enjoyed Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies so much that they've inspired me to actually read a book. I cannot stress enough what a big deal that is. I could probably count on one hand the number of films that have made me go back and read the book version. Villeneuve's telling of this story and visualization of this world and humanization of these characters have been so compelling and awe-inspiring that it made me pick up Frank Herbert's original novel to see what the blueprint was. I don't hate the David Lynch version as much as some people do. It's certainly a dazzling visual treat, but it never made me want to check out the source material. Dune Part 2 has all the qualities that made Dune Part 1 such an impressive cinematic achievement. Hans Zimmer's otherworldly score plants you in this gonzo vision of the distant future, Greg Fraser's breathtaking cinematography immerses you in the sandy plains of Arrakis, and Villeneuve's old-school commitment to practical effects and filming locations over CGI and green screens makes a world of difference. But Part 2 is also a bigger, bolder movie than Part 1. Part 1 was all build-up, and Part 2 is all payoff, with messianic meditations and Lord of the Rings-sized battle scenes. It was truly a sight to behold on the big screen. One of the issues I had with Gladiator 2 is that Paul Mescal is an art house thespian who doesn't quite have the chops for a Russell Crowe movie star performance galvanizing the troops. When Timothée Chalamet was cast as Paul Atreides, I worried he'd have the same problem. He has the brooding nuance to play Paul, but I wasn't sure if he had the bravado to play Lisan al-Gaib. Thankfully, in Dune Part 2, Chalamet proved me wrong. He digs into the moral complexity of Paul indulging a white lie for the greater good.
We gave them something to hope for.
That's not hope!
But he also captures the charismatic leadership that wins over the Fremen. As Paul goes down a dark path, Zendaya's Chani takes over as the film's protagonist. She nails the character's badassery on the battlefield, but also humanizes her with a deep emotional vulnerability. And Austin Butler creates an unforgettable villain with very little screen time as Fade Rother. Butler's Fade is slick, sadistic, and unabashedly evil. He really disappears into the role, and not just because of the bald cap. Before I read the book, I just assumed that Villeneuve and his team were unwaveringly faithful to Herbert's text. Now that I've read the book, I can see that he made a few key changes, but those changes were arguably for the better. Villeneuve's biggest alteration to the source material is reframing the second half of the story from Chani's perspective. This was an ingenious move to avoid the mistake that Herbert made. Herbert hated the fact that a lot of readers came away from the book viewing Paul Atreides as a hero. By showing Paul's rise to power and moral downfall through Chani's concerned eyes, Villeneuve ensures the audience sees Paul for the bad influence he is. With its tale of a supposed messiah trying and failing to convince his zealous followers that he's not a messiah, Dune Part 2 is essentially Life of Brian reimagined as a futuristic action epic.
Not Mahdi.
Kudenesh dokum. Tadaneja nakolik anayanak. Boeberek snetter. Oh, Gisla.
I am not the Messiah, do you understand? Honestly!
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
It's a spot-on religious satire baked into this giant intergalactic war movie. Villeneuve perfectly captures the bizarre alien worlds that Herbert conjured up, but he also captures the political and theological messaging underneath the sci-fi surrealism. I've always enjoyed Yorgos Lanthimos' weird-ass movies. The Lobster is a great dystopian riff on the absurdity of dating, and The Favourite upended everything I hate about costume dramas. But I didn't truly love one of his movies until I watched Poor Things earlier this year. When I took myself down to the cinema on its opening day, I was expecting to be disturbed and bewildered. I didn't expect to have a big smile on my face for 2.5 hours. This movie has stunning cinematography, gorgeous production design, and thought-provoking themes of human nature, but it's also absolutely hilarious. It opens with a suicide and a graphic brain transplant, and yet it's as funny as Spinal Tap. Emma Stone gives one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen in this movie. She does things I've never seen any other actor even attempt. She charts the rapid physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development of a child from infant to toddler all the way up to maturity. She nails all the subtleties of Bella Baxter's developing speech, motor skills, and basic comprehension. She nails the hilarious, unfiltered ramblings of a kid who hasn't learned self-censorship yet and says whatever's on her mind.
I must go punch that baby.
She captures Bella's childlike wonder as she discovers the joys of the world, and she captures her bitter disappointment as she learns that the world is cruel and unfair. It's also a strangely empowering character. Bella is a woman free of all the societal pressures of being a woman, free of the shame that would have been instilled in her if she'd grown up the normal way. And I know there was a bit of a controversy over Stone's Oscar win, because the optics of a white woman winning over the Academy's first ever Native American nominee aren't great, but there's no denying that this is a tour de force performance pushing the boundaries of what an actor can do. Poor Things made a lot of people uncomfortable, and I can completely understand why. Bella Baxter walks, talks, and acts like a child, but she has an adult libido and she has a lot of sex throughout the film. I can see why some people wouldn't find that entertaining, but I think the way it executes that premise is an ingenious satire of the born sexy yesterday trope. I've seen some people say it just indulges that trope, but I'd argue it subverts it. Yes, Bella has the mind of a child and gets absurdly sexualized, but she has a lot more agency and independence than Lilu in The Fifth Element or Quora in Tron Legacy. Lilu and Quora aren't the protagonists of their stories, they're the objectified love interests of the protagonists. They're just there to serve a male fantasy. In Poor Things, Bella is the protagonist, and the men infatuated with her, namely Mark Ruffalo's Duncan Wedderburn, are depicted as the creepy sleazeballs they are.
Oh.
Poor Things shows time and time again that even though Bella has the cognitive development of a 5-year-old, she's still smarter and more emotionally mature than any of the men around her. Bella might have the mind of a child, but Duncan is the one who's acting childish.
You were in my son.
What?
Poor Things is a movie like no other. It's as disturbing as Blue Velvet, but it's also as funny as Spaceballs. Production designers Shona Heath and James Price transport you to a bizarre steampunk world completely of its own. Lanthimos' unbridled imagination and Stone's fearless commitment make Poor Things a true masterpiece, and one of the most daring films ever made.
Orange? Who made the console orange?
Do I look orange?
I didn't touch it.
Orange is not my color.
Not me. Hello, everybody!
I'm in a near constant state of anxiety, to the point that it's like my wallet and keys, it's on my person at all times. And I'm a huge fan of Pixar's brand of wholesome, all-ages entertainment. So when Pixar announced they were making Anxiety the movie, I was pretty damn excited, and Inside Out 2 did not disappoint. Not only is it a great animated film that's fun for the whole family, it gets everything about its depiction of anxiety exactly right. Everything I've ever learned about anxiety, from hundreds of pounds worth of therapy, I could have learned from this 90-minute movie for a £10 cinema ticket.
We can't control whether Riley makes the team, but what can we control?
Well, oh, Riley has a Spanish test tomorrow. We need to study.
Oh, you're right!
Inside Out 2 rounds out Riley into more of an individual character. In the first Inside Out, Riley was pretty much a blank slate that any kid watching the film could project themselves onto. But in Inside Out 2, we get to know Riley a bit better. We spend as much time with Riley herself as we do with her emotions. By making us more endeared to Riley as a human being and not just an avatar, Inside Out 2 makes the stakes feel sky high. A lot of big blockbusters are about the end of the world or some other mega-scale conflict, but it's hard to relate to that on a personal level. In Inside Out 2, there's no one trying to destroy the world. There's just a negative emotion trying to swap out a 13-year-old girl's joyful sense of self for a more anxious state. But when Riley's sense of self is at stake, it feels like the world is about to end. The character of Anxiety captures what anxiety is better than any other film I've ever seen. Maya Hawke's incredible performance manages to simultaneously embody what anxiety does to you and what anxiety feels like. She's manic, restless, and stressed up the wazoo. She comes up with an endless stream of daunting what-if scenarios, and she creates an impending sense that everything's about to go to shit. It would have been easy to portray Anxiety as a straightforward villain, but it's a lot more nuanced than that, and the movie digs into that nuance. Anxiety thinks it's helping you by warning you about everything that could possibly go wrong. It's oblivious to how destructive it is. It's not your enemy, it's more like a toxic friend, and Inside Out 2 nails that aspect of Anxiety.
She fails to impress the coach, does not become a firehawk, and finally arrives at high school. She has no one. She eats alone, and only the teachers know her name.
Ew.
Okay, you and I are gonna be friends.
Oh.
There's nothing in Inside Out 2 that's quite as unforgettable as the death of Bing Bong, but that was always going to be a tough act to follow, and the sequel has plenty of memorable moments of its own. It has a ton of great gags like the sarcasm and Lance Slashblade's power move, nostalgia is a laugh riot whenever she's on screen, and Anger stuffing his hand into Pouchy's mouth at the film's climax is a delightfully deranged bit.
What do you think? I have everything in here? I offered you the rubber ducky. I offered you the
I know what to do, but we're gonna need a lot more dynamite.
You know what? Good luck!
But there are just as many scenes that tug on the heartstrings, like Joy counteracting Anxiety's destructive what-if scenarios with much more optimistic what-ifs. It's a story about emotions that elicits a wide range of emotions. Riley's panic attack gives this movie a riveting climactic sequence. It was a stroke of genius to visualize it as a whirlwind around the console. Not only is the anxiety tornado a really cinematic image, it also encapsulates what a panic attack feels like. It's overwhelming and exhausting and really scary. It's really cathartic and heartwarming to see Riley ground herself by holding onto her hockey stick, and see her friends come over to support her, and see her overcome her first panic attack. The first Inside Out was all about recognizing the positive role of sadness, which was something we all needed to hear. The second one has a more complex message about realizing it's okay to not be perfect. Joy represses all of Riley's negative thoughts about herself to convince her that she's perfect. And in the end, she realizes she's being just as controlling and unhelpful as anxiety. So she finally lets go and allows the full spectrum of Riley's thoughts and memories to come flooding into her belief system, polluting her ideal self-image with the messiness of real life. Like all the best Pixar films, Inside Out 2 has a message we could all use. As long as we're always striving to be better, it's okay to not be perfect. Our flaws are what make us human. If Riley can accept that about herself, then so can we.
Three carrots.
What about 4? Or 5? Or 6?
I've loved Sean Baker since Tangerine, and I've loved Mikey Madison since Better Things, so when the news broke that they were working on a movie together, I was sure I would like it. Then when it started getting awards buzz, I was certain it would be a great film. But what I didn't expect was how funny it would be. You hear Oscar contender, and you expect a really dour, serious movie.
Cinema is an event.
But Anora is the hardest I've laughed in a cinema all year. It is a touching character study dealing with some really deep dramatic themes, and it definitely has its share of tear-jerking moments, but it's also hilarious. Baker's previous movies have all been very funny, but Anora might be the funniest film he's made to date. Anora is essentially a rags to riches back to rags story told in 3 parts. Each of these parts is completely different from the others, but utterly compelling in its own way. The first part is an edgier, grittier version of Pretty Woman, about a sex worker being swept off her feet by a wealthy John. Baker shoots and edits this initial chapter with an almost dreamlike quality. You get swept up in the whirlwind romance, but it digs a lot deeper than the Hollywood fantasy of Pretty Woman. Baker blurs the line between a transactional relationship and genuine affection. Annie and Vanya clearly have real feelings for each other, but the monetary aspect is always hanging over them. There's a screwball charm to this section of the film, almost like it happened one night, but there's also this looming sense that it won't last and it's all about to come crashing down. The second part is a Coen Brothers crime caper about bumbling henchmen trying to clean up a mess, as Vanya's dad sends his goon squad to get the marriage annulled by any means necessary. Annie assumes Vanya will stand by her because he loves her, but he flees the scene and abandons her, and she and the goons spend all night trying to find him. This was by far my favourite part of the film. It's when a charming rom-com becomes a non-stop laugh riot. With all the bickering between Annie, Toros, and Toros' henchmen, I had a big smile on my face through this whole section of the film. The third and final part of Anora is a sobering snap back to reality. Throughout the whole exhaustive search for Vanya, Annie remains convinced that he'll make everything right. He'll convince his parents to let him stay married to her, there'll be one big loving family, and they'll live happily ever after. But as soon as he's confronted by his parents, he caves. Annie finally sees Vanya for what he is, a spoilt brat, an immature man-child, not husband material in the slightest. But there's nothing she can do about it besides sign the papers, take the hush money, and go back to her non-luxurious life. I got really excited when Annie threatened to sue the family, but that excitement was short-lived as Vanya's mom calmly explained that she would use her wealth and influence to destroy Annie's life before the suit went anywhere. It would have been great to see Annie sue this family and get to live the high life after all, but that's not the world we live in. The poor being powerless at the mercy of the rich is sadly a much more accurate reflection of reality. Anora filters the classic Cinderella fairy tale through the bleak lens of Baker's signature slice-of-life cinema. It's a love story that only Baker could tell. It makes you fall out of love just as quickly as you fell in love. Madison is a revelation in this movie. Even as a longtime fan, I was blown away by what she was able to do. And on top of everything else, Anora made me enjoy Take That's Greatest Day for the first time in my entire life. I love when filmmakers use horror as a vehicle for satire. The shock value of horror for horror's sake can certainly be a lot of fun, but I think the genre is at its best when a visionary director is using disturbing imagery and familiar tropes to comment on real-world issues in a darkly hilarious way. American Psycho, Jennifer's Body, Society, They Live. Issues like misogyny and the class divide are really scary, and movies like this make that terror more literal. And that brings us to my favourite horror film of 2024, Coralie Farjar's The Substance. A big, ballsy, blood-drenched body horror allegory for Hollywood's unrealistic standards of beauty, and society's dismissive attitude towards women of a certain age. The best way to describe The Substance is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane as directed by David Cronenberg. It uses a fictional beauty-enhancing drug as a satirical stand-in for all the dangerous cosmetic procedures that people undergo to cling to their youth.
Younger, more beautiful, more perfect. This is The Substance.
As she starts losing work past the age of 50, washed-up starlet Elizabeth Sparkle begins taking this drug to improve her appearance, and it quickly gets way out of hand. The tragic irony is that Elizabeth initially takes the substance because she wants to feel better about herself. She creates her younger counterpart, Sue, to boost her self-esteem, but Sue just becomes the Hyde to her Jekyll and siphons out what little youth she has left. As Sue enjoys more and more time in the spotlight, Elizabeth devolves into a monster. Like Dorian Gray, her vanity becomes her undoing. I love when a horror movie establishes a hard and fast rule that you know will be broken. In Gremlins, you're not allowed to feed the Mogwai after midnight. In Talk to Me, you're not allowed to use the hand for more than 90 seconds. As Elizabeth begins the treatment, the substance sets up a bunch of these rules. Don't use the activator serum more than once. Only spend 7 days at a time in each body, no exceptions. As all these rules are being laid out, you know they're going to be broken one by one with disastrous consequences, and you get to just sit back and watch the freak show. Every time a rule is broken, it leads to something even more unexpected and even more horrifying than the last. I had a big grin on my face the whole movie, waiting to see what would happen as all these rules were flagrantly ignored in the name of narcissism. The Substance has a perfect horror metaphor for every issue of aging and womanhood and showbiz sexism. The Substance itself is a perfect metaphor for elective plastic surgery. Elizabeth's car crash is a perfect metaphor for a Hollywood celebrity suddenly reaching her expiration date and having her career ground to a halt. Sue sucking all the youth out of Elizabeth is a great metaphor for the notion of daughters stealing their mother's beauty. And the hideous spectacle of Monstro Eliza Sue is a perfect metaphor for what the cosmetic industry has done to women in society. For the most part, The Substance shares the broad, absurdist worldview of David Lynch and John Waters. It's not set in the world we live in, it takes place in a heightened reality. This is established early on when a thick layer of snow falls on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It's set in a world where aerobics videos are still as popular as they were in the 80s, where an FDA-approved drug leaves its user comatose for weeks at a time, and where a grotesque monster can walk down the street and no one will bat an eye. But it's all grounded in real emotion. The scene where Elizabeth is getting ready for a date and keeps going back to the mirror and comparing herself to Sue and second-guessing her appearance to the point that she never even leaves the apartment is the most heartbreaking scene in the film, and it's painfully relatable for middle-aged women in the dating pool. This scene is a microcosm of the whole movie. As Elizabeth keeps going back to the bathroom mirror and trying to improve her appearance, she actually looks worse and worse. It's symbolic of the film's key message that cosmetic enhancements ultimately do more harm than good. They're supposed to make you look and feel better, but they're destructive. Aging naturally always looks better than trying to unnaturally slow down the aging process. Elizabeth looked great with her original makeup, but the more she changed it and the younger she tried to look, the worse it got. That's The Substance in a nutshell. Demi Moore gives the best performance of her career in The Substance. She brings real depth and emotion to this insane horror story. Farjar's jump cuts give the movie a French New Wave rhythm, and Pierre-Olivier Person created some of the greatest makeup and prosthetic effects I've ever seen. As Sue sticks around long after her 7 days are up, Elizabeth's transformation into an old witch is as shocking as it is funny. Monstro Eliza Sue is a masterpiece, a grotesque amalgamation of every ridiculous male fantasy. Farjar has a lot to say about societal pressures on women's bodies with The Substance, but she also takes a lot of joy in playing in the genre sandbox. By the time the movie gets to its blood-soaked Carrie finale, it's as if Farjar is saying, okay, you get the message, now we're just gonna have fun with it. I've enjoyed a lot of new films I've seen this year, but far and away the most original concept, the wildest execution, and the most gratifying theatrical experience was Mike Cheslick's slapstick piece Hundreds of Beavers. This movie is absolute anarchy. It doesn't let up for a second, it plays like a live-action cartoon, and it's imbued with so much imagination. The best way to describe it is The Revenant meets Looney Tunes. It's about a fur trapper who has to kill hundreds of beavers to win the hand of a merchant's beautiful daughter. But the animals are all played by adults in mascot costumes, and the weapons he uses could have been manufactured by Acme. I went into Hundreds of Beavers completely blind. I hadn't seen the trailer, I'd just read a brief feature in Empire about how it would be coming to UK cinemas for one night only. When that night came, I went down with my dad and my sister and we had no idea what to expect. For the first 5 minutes or so, I was plunged into this indie oddity that's half scratchy silent movie and half hand-drawn animation. And I was thinking, what the fuck am I watching? But then I got into it and I ended up having a blast. Hundreds of Beavers is a masterclass in visual storytelling. It gets every story beat and character development across almost entirely without dialogue. Cheslick gets really creative in showing what the characters are thinking and how they get from point A to point B. It's a masterclass in economic filmmaking too. It's amazing what they were able to pull off on such a slim budget with such limited resources. Cheslick had a really ambitious vision for this film, involving a beaver Voltron and a giant beaver dam modelled after a Bond villain's lair, and he brought that vision to life with handcrafted animation seamlessly stitched into the live action. Hundreds of Beavers is a classic nature fights backstory like Jaws or The Birds. Natural thrillers were popularized in the 60s and 70s, around the same time the environmentalist movement started gaining traction. They're parables about arrogant humans messing with the natural order. Hundreds of Beavers is a prime example of this genre. It's just the most absurd, bonkers version possible. Like Mayor Vaughn and Tippi Hedren, John Kayak fucks around with nature and finds out. I've seen some people complain that Hundreds of Beavers drags a bit in the middle, and I can see where that complaint is coming from. It does get a little repetitive as Jean keeps cycling around the map checking on his traps, but I have two defenses for that. One, it ties into the film's open world video game style, and two, it builds on each gag every time he comes back around. As ridiculous as the story is, it adheres to its own insane logic. Every story beat has a payoff. The Sherlock Holmes beaver eventually solves the case, the dam that's being gradually built is the location of the climactic showdown, and Jean eventually marries the merchant's daughter. A madcap mashup of Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush, America's Funniest Home Videos, and a Mario Let's Play, Hundreds of Beavers is a genuine labor of love. It was shot with a 6-person crew across 12 weeks in sub-zero temperatures. Cheslick created more than 1,500 visual effects for the movie over the course of an arduous 2-year post-production process, and every ounce of that care and effort is apparent on the screen. In a film-going landscape full of soulless corporate products like a Dwayne Johnson Santa bodyguard movie or a Moana sequel cobbled together from a half-finished Disney Plus series, it's heartening to see a lovingly crafted micro-budget indie make such a big splash. You don't usually see a response from cinema audiences in the UK. You see clips of American audiences hooting and hollering when Steve Rogers summons Thor's hammer, but that hardly ever happens in the UK. Anyone cheering in a British cinema at the sight of Tobey Maguire in Spider-Man No Way Home would have been told to shut the fuck up. But Hundreds of Beavers is an exception. It's the first time I've ever heard a round of applause at the end of a film, and it was much deserved. So there you have an exhaustive rundown of my top 10 films of 2024. What were your favourite films this year? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you liked the video. Remember to like and subscribe and click on the little bell. And also seize the day and call your mom and be kind to yourself.